I'm not going to get into an argument or a discussion about how we divide hypothetical revenues.
The Prime Minister weighed in on BC's growing pipeline fight today. BC Premier Christy Clark has drawn the line in the sand. If BC doesn't get a fair share of the proposed Northern Gateway pipeline profits, it's not going to happen. And just last week, Harper's senior BC minister, James Moore, took a shot at Enbridge, the company behind the pipeline. Now the government is reiterating that the pipeline is undergoing a proper review and the verdict on it is far from decided. But will science or politics determine whether or not this pipeline becomes a reality? And after months of criticism and now a threat by an outspoken premier, is the federal government starting to feel the squeeze on the Northern Gateway? Well, let's find out. Joining me now from Victoria is Green Party leader and BC MP Elizabeth May. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hannah.
So what's your position on the current spat between BC Premier Christy Clark and Alberta and Ottawa over the Northern Gateway? And are there any concessions that can be made to make this pipeline acceptable?
Well, first of all, I think, that I've heard people refer to the controversy between Christy Clark as BC Premier and Alberta's Premier Alison Redford as a tiff or a spat. I mean, this is fundamental stuff. This is a question of whether British Columbians, who overwhelmingly oppose this project, should be forced to accept the risks of 1,100 kilometers of pipeline through rugged wilderness and terrain that really pose serious challenges to building it and maintaining it. And then the riskiest part of the venture, in my view, is supertankers in and out of the port of Kitimat. I think most British Columbians at this point oppose this project and see it as presenting really unacceptable levels of risk. A lot of British Columbians were pleased to hear Premier Christy Clark say anything on the project, but she appeared to say, if you give us the money, we might be prepared to accept the risk. A lot of British Columbians don't think there's enough money in the world to make up for the jobs in our fisheries and in tourism if there were to be a spill. And given the extreme treacherous natures of the waters in and around Kitimat and in the Hecate Strait, the idea of supertankers plying those waters, which, by the way, of course, wouldn't be managed by Enbridge. There are persons unknown who would be bringing supertankers in and out to take not just processed crude, but bitumen crude mixed with diluent, which is a very hazardous material, and as the Enbridge spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan proved, very, very difficult to clean out. So I think the answer from our point of view is no, you can't convince us this project could go ahead.
But BC is a gateway. Can you just shut it down to down the road, any form of pipeline, anything like that? Is it just saying, nope, we're not going to allow you to do this?
Well, I think we have to look at this as a nation and say, and this is one of the things that gets missing, is if we could have a national energy strategy and we were looking at how do we use our resources in Canada to the best and largest benefit for Canadians, perhaps we'd want to have energy security. Perhaps we'd want to ask the question, does it make sense for half of Canada, basically Ontario East, to be buying its crude from OPEC nations, from Venezuela, from Kazakhstan, or does it make sense to actually find ways to move the bitumen crude to refineries within Canada for use in Canada? So there's a lot of a discussion that doesn't happen here when it boils down to, as it has up until today, Prime Minister Harper saying, you're going to get this pipeline whether you like it or not, and if you oppose this pipeline, you're a radical or you're against Canada. The toning down of his rhetoric today to say he's actually interested in what the Joint Review Panel might have to say is an about-face.
Now, the Prime Minister, as you mentioned, commented on how the Northern Gateway proposal will be dealt with. Now, take a listen to what he had to say.
The only way that governments can handle controversial projects of this manner is to ensure that things are evaluated on an independent basis, scientifically, and not simply on political criteria.
Okay, so doesn't that make sense to rely on science, as the Prime Minister said?
It's the first time he said it. I've got to say, he went to Beijing and he told them the project was going ahead. The omnibus budget bill this spring, Bill C-38, was largely about eviscerating various environmental laws, repealing the Environmental Assessment Act, gutting the Fisheries Act, changing the Species at Risk Act, changing the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the number one beneficiary as a project was the Enbridge proposed pipeline. So the Prime Minister has been, up until today, acting as though to oppose this project, to question this project, was to question the national health and welfare of Canada.
So aren't you happy he said that they will rely on the science?
I'm pleased to hear any sign of reason from the Prime Minister on this project. As I said, when he was in China, in Beijing, he committed to them, and they're the main beneficiaries in terms of getting raw bitumen for processing at refineries in China. He had, in China, committed this project would go ahead. Now, it's really encouraging to have him show any interest in the evidence. But just on Friday, August 3rd, the Minister of Environment sent a letter to the Joint Review Panel saying this is the deadline for your report, and as soon as the report is received, we want the National Energy Board to render its decision. And by the way, the final decision will not be the National Energy Board's or British Columbians. It will be the federal cabinet. So I hope and pray they will be guided by what evidence they hear. But this is, I think, more of a political dodge to create some political space for Christy Clark, who is, of the various candidates running for premier and re-election next spring, one closely aligned with Stephen Harper on a number of other issues. Certainly the NDP, which right now leads in the polls provincially here in BC, has a much stronger position in opposition to the pipeline. And I think Stephen Harper is finally recognizing that this is not an issue that can be shoved down the throats of British Columbians. We will not accept risky pipelines and risky supertankers. And perhaps this is a dodge just to get BC past the next provincial election.
Now, you're just talking about that deadline. The government imposed the deadline of December 31st, 2013 for the Joint Review Panel to finish its report so the government can make its decision by June 2014. So what questions do you want to see answered by that deadline?
Well, certainly I think there are very large questions which may not be possibly answered given the Joint Review Panel's current level of consultations with First Nations, but there are many First Nations along that pipeline route with fundamental questions that touch on their constitutionally protected rights. But we also want to know, as a matter of, I think the reality is that you can't get supertankers safely in and out of Kitimat and through the Hecate Strait. The Transport Canada report that was widely reported in the media as though it said you could, merely said there were no regulatory gaps. In other words, if you get an oil spill, the agency in charge is Environment Canada. That isn't to say that you can do it safely. That just says we know who's in charge if there's a spill. I don't think British Columbians will be persuaded that there is a safe approach to 1,100 kilometers of pipeline. Certainly when Enbridge's safety record has now been so viciously castigated by U.S. enforcers.
Let's talk about their safety record just quickly, because Heritage Minister and BCer James Moore had harsh words for Enbridge last week, telling CKNW's Bill Good they had a long way to go to reassure British Columbians on their pipeline safety. But Enbridge took out, here's that full-page ad in 2 national papers today saying, quote, just take a listen, over the last decade alone, we've transported nearly 12 billion barrels of crude oil with a safe delivery record, better than 99.999%. Says we'll never stop striving for 100%. The ad is signed by the Enbridge CEO, Pat Daniel, and President Al Monaco. So how prepared are you to work with companies like Enbridge to ensure they make it to 100% safety record?
Of course, we're always prepared to work with companies, but Enbridge's safety record is not well represented by their advertising campaign. They've run pretty pastel ads all through BC on television, but the United States Transport Agency that reviewed how they handled a real pipeline break in real life and a leak was to describe them as Keystone cops who didn't know what they were doing, who continued to pump oil into a broken pipeline for 17 hours after they should have known they were pumping oil into the Kalamazoo River. This is not a company that has a safety record that has anyone reassured. And I question where the heck is our Minister of Environment, Peter Kent? He was out the gate defending Enbridge and saying, oh, no, that was an old pipeline. We don't have to worry about that with Enbridge. I query, will that pipeline never get old? And meanwhile, it's James Moore who steps up and says British Columbians question how much we can trust Enbridge, given the Kalamazoo, Michigan break, which got a lot of attention, and just a few weeks ago, just this summer, another pipeline break in Wisconsin, which, by the way, was a new pipeline. So we have a lot of concerns about the safety and integrity of the pipelines, but even if the pipeline could be guaranteed to be 100% perfect, which I don't think anyone can, we have the problem that supertankers have been banned from the BC coast since 1972, with the exception of Vancouver, port. And all up and down that coastline, around Haida Gwaii, around, certainly near Kitimat, we have very treacherous waters that are not at all suitable for supertankers.
Elizabeth May, thank you so much for joining us on this topic today.
Thank you so much, Anna.
That's Green Party leader Elizabeth May out of Victoria.